This is something I've never told anyone until now. When I was in my teens, my parents would take me to a place named Ketty in California to just get away for some peace and quiet. It was a beautiful place with small little rivers and trees everywhere. There were cabins as well that we would stay in when we would go there. There would often be other families there with their children for me to play with. Lots of fond memories there. That was several years ago, and now I'm just a normal 9-to-5 working adult going about my mundane life. Although in my early 20s I would still visit Ketty on occasion to ease my mind and escape for a while. I didn't rent a cabin when I would go alone. They were usually all rented out to families, and besides that, I couldn't afford it on the money I was making at the time. So I would just make my way there and pitch a tent just inside the tree line in hopes I wouldn't be bothered. I could see the cabins from where I would pitch my tent. It definitely made for a nostalgic experience, and I loved it. The day I'm going to tell you about was Saturday. I remember it was a Saturday because I was reading a chapter from my psychology book and trying to study for the midterm that would be taking place on Monday. The day was just an ordinary day until the sun went down. Late that night, I heard screams coming from one of the cabins. I jumped up in a panic when I heard it, but immediately after I could hear laughing coming from the same direction. Damn kids, why don't parents keep their children quiet this late at night, is the thought that ran through my head. I remember hearing lots of noises and commotion coming from the direction of the cabins for about 20 minutes. Finally, though, it quieted down and I thought nothing more of it and drifted off to sleep after finishing up my studies. I wanted to get an early start, so the next morning I packed up my stuff just as the sun was peeking over the horizon and headed back home. Fast forward to Monday after class. I had just taken my midterm and stopped by the local cafe to pick up my favorite meal, open-faced pot roast sandwiches, to celebrate the midterm being over. As I waited for my meal to arrive, I overheard some elderly gentlemen talking about someone being stabbed to death. What an odd Monday afternoon cafe conversation. Then my ear happened to catch the word Ketty, at which point I could literally feel my face move into an "oh shit" expression. I went over to the men, apologized for my eavesdropping, and asked them to please tell me about the incident they were talking about. The men then described to me the horrors that took place right outside my tent. A mother and at least 2 of her children, they weren't exactly sure of the number at that time, had been violently murdered in cabin 28 in Ketty. I was in complete shock. I didn't know what to feel at that moment. My tent had been right across the way of those sets of cabins. Then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Holy God, the screams I heard that night weren't just children playing. It was the sound of people being bludgeoned to death. After some time had passed, I learned more details about what had happened. A mother, her child, and I believe her child's girlfriend, had been bound by the feet and hands, beaten with a hammer, and stabbed multiple times all over their bodies, including their throats, so hard that it bent the blade. One other child, a female, had gone missing from the cabin after that night. 3 years later, her skull and some of her bones were found in the woods, in a different part of that area. I've never returned after that last visit. There's no way in hell I'm going back there. They never found the people responsible. Sure, there were suspects, but nothing ever came of it, and the case went cold. I think to myself a lot about what that poor mother and her children could have done, if anything, to deserve the cruel death that was handed down to them. Just before Christmas, I asked my aunt if I could borrow her cabin by the lake for the weekend for some relaxation time for my wife and I. She, of course, said it was fine, and that Friday around noon, I made the 30-minute drive to get things ready for the weekend. My wife would be joining me after she got off work around 7 p.m. I prepared things for the evening, and when 6 p.m. rolled around, I decided to order a pizza as there was no food in the cabin. It hadn't dawned on me to go to the grocery store. I'd have to do it the next day. I called up the mom and pop pizza place in town and handed out my order and address. The delivery time I was quoted was 45 minutes, so I ended the call and decided to turn on the TV and chill while I waited for my pizza. I must have dozed off because I remember waking up to the sound of someone banging on the door. I jumped up and glanced out the window that looked directly in front of the cabin, and where the driveway was, I saw a small black pickup truck sitting there. My wife drives a red sedan, so I figured it must be the pizza. That was quick, I remember thinking, as it had only been just over 30 minutes since I made the call. The door to the cabin was old and didn't have a peephole or anything. The truck didn't have any markings indicating it belonged to any business, so I asked who it was before opening the door. The person on the other side promptly said, "Delivery." Okay then, and I swung open the door. As soon as I did, I hit the floor. I didn't know what exactly had happened other than I was hit with something in the head incredibly hard. I almost felt like I was going to pass out immediately because it hurt so bad. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing there dressed in black and wearing a black ball cap. My eyes had begun to water from the blow to my head, and I couldn't make out the person's face. Right at that moment, I could hear someone entering the driveway. The person at the door turned and ran, and I jumped up and made my way to the door to see what he was doing and who had pulled in. It was my wife, and directly behind her, pulling in with her, was another car that had a lit-up sign on its roof. It was the pizza delivery guy. The person who had hit me jumped in his truck and tore out of the driveway, throwing dirt everywhere. I yelled for my wife to call the police, and she did. I gave the police all the information I had, and we ended up eating a lukewarm pizza after it was all over. I was fine, just a very sore bump on the head. I never heard anything more about it until 2 weeks later, when my aunt called me to tell me that they had found the person responsible for what happened. It turns out I was the third person he had attacked in such a manner. When he was arrested, he had a police scanner in his possession that was capable of picking up and decrypting cell phone signals. He had been listening in to phone calls in the area in an attempt to find victims, I'm guessing. They found all manner of torture devices and whatnot in his truck. You just never know when you're going to run into one of the crazies out there. I'm glad it didn't escalate any further than it did. 2 years ago, I bought a cabin in Colorado for hunting and to escape to whenever I felt like it. It sits in an area completely alone. Nothing around except for an abandoned barn from a farm that used to be out there. I only make the trip usually twice a year. Every time I visited that place, it seemed like snow was on the ground everywhere, which almost gave the old place a picturesque look with the mountains in the background and all. Anyways, one November I decided to make my way to the cabin alone. I'm divorced and have no children. I had had a very tough time at work. People being laid off left and right, resulting in the entire company being short-handed. Basically just almost unbearable stress is the best way I can describe it. I arrived to the cabin in the evening, and the sun was just beginning to set. I trotted in immediately and started a wood fire in the fireplace. I even stopped by the store to grab some marshmallows on the way in. Man, do I love roasted marshmallows, roasted over a fire. All was well. I had dinner, more than a few marshmallows, and made my way to bed later that evening for some much-needed rest. The cabin is completely open, other than the bathroom. The bedroom, living room, and kitchen have no walls. It's basically just one giant room. I pretty much fell asleep immediately, but it didn't last long. I had a couple ruptured discs in my back, so I can't lie in one spot for too long, or the pain just kills me. I rolled over to try to readjust and was just drifting off again when I was jarred awake by knocking at the door. I jumped up and answered it. It was a disheveled-looking man, shivering. It was around 30 degrees outside and it was snowing, so I'm sure he was freezing. He begged to come in, that his truck had broken down a mile down the road and he had no cell phone service. I of course asked him to come in and warm up. He then asked if he could stay the night and leave out in the morning to see about getting his truck repaired. I was very hesitant at first, but told him it would be okay. I gave him some blankets and he laid down on the couch. I too tried to get back to sleep and did after a few minutes of my mind wandering. Sadly, just a few minutes later I heard shuffling again and I opened my eyes. The man was now in a sitting position with his legs crossed in an Indian position, facing me on the couch, just staring at me with a smile. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked him. "Nah, I just can't sleep," he said. I closed my eyes. Again, a shuffling noise. When I opened my eyes again, he was now standing about 10 feet from my bed, looking directly at me, still smiling. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Oh, nothing," he replied. At that moment, I reached under my bed and pulled out the rifle that I had put there the very first time I had came there, and told him that he could walk out that door right now one of two ways, full of holes or none at all, his choice. His smile disappeared, and he made his way to the door and walked out. I ran to the window to see him walking away from the house and across the street to the old abandoned barn. He casually walked behind it out of my view, and 10 seconds later came flying out from behind the building in an old, beat-up truck. I know for a fact there was no vehicle there before. He hadn't really broken down. Everything that happened was intentional. I still wonder what he planned on doing to me that night.